Welcome to the Outthinker podcast. Each week, we talk with forward-looking strategists and innovators that are challenging the status quo, leading the future of business, and shaping our world. I'm your host, Kai Krippendorf, founder of the Outthinker Strategy Network. This episode is part of a special sub-series we embarked on as a special Outthinker research project for 2022. As business models adapt and change, business ecosystems, think technology partnerships, airline alliances, among other examples, are becoming increasingly critical to developing a competitive advantage. Co-opetition is overtaking competition, where players in an ecosystem compete together as allies against other ecosystems. We hope you enjoy learning about these powerful partnerships and how you can apply these practices to your own business. Ben Gomes-Casseres has worked on ecosystem strategies for 3 decades as a researcher, a teacher, and an advisor. His newest book is Remix Strategy, The 3 Laws of Business Combinations. He also offers 2 online courses on LinkedIn Learning, strategic partnerships, and ecosystems and platforms. He's a professor at Brandeis University. He directs the Asper Center for Global Entrepreneurship there. Previously, he was at Harvard Business School and the World Bank. He's published 5 books and numerous articles and case studies on business combinations and alliances. His views have appeared widely on the business press. He holds degrees from Harvard, Princeton, Brandeis. And what's also interesting, he's a native of Curacao and speaks 4 languages, including the native language of Curacao. Ben, thank you so much for being here with us.
My pleasure, Kaihan. It's good to see you again.
So I don't know many people, I can count them on one finger, who have been studying ecosystem-based competition as long as you, and you don't necessarily always use the word ecosystem. I understand that. How did you fall into that as an interest area?
It does go way back, and it does go 3 decades back. So let me tell you, I was at the Harvard Business School at the time, and I had just finished my dissertation publications on the topic of joint ventures and alliances. And I was studying the computer industry. And suddenly I started running into examples of American computer companies that didn't have only one joint venture or one alliance that I had to study, but they had a whole bunch of them. And I tried to map these out. And it turns out that when you map them out, you see something different. And one company that I studied that really had this to the extreme, let's say, was a company called MIPS Computer Systems, MIPS, P as in Peter. And it was actually a small company, a startup, in a very niche field called risk computing, which is still folks in coding will know about this.
RISC. Right?
RISC. Risk computing, in that sense, reduced instruction set computing. That's the rabbit hole I had to go into to understand what was going on, which I did. So I became, an expert in business strategy in risk computing. And what it turns out to be was that it was a new way of doing basically computational code on semiconductor chips. And it was different than what, for example, Intel and the dominant chip players at the time were doing, which was complex instruction set computing, CISC. And in order to get risk adopted in the marketplace, it turns out that these companies created a whole team of players to compete against Intel. So you would have MIPS Computer System, which was a small designer startup, and they then licensed this technology to 2 or 3 different companies, large companies around the world, in Europe and in Japan and the US, including Digital Equipment Corporation was their other big US customers. And then they also had licenses, in a way, contracts with the actual computer systems makers, and then the software vendors that would write software for risk. And so it was very clear that a new technology like that could not take over the market or even compete against something as strong as the standards that were set by Intel, unless it had a whole team and unless it kind of seeded the market.
So you're not saying a team inside MISC, you're saying a team of other companies.
Yes, thank you for making the clarification. And that led to actually my first article in Harvard Business Review, which was in 1994. It was the same issue that Rosabeth Moss-Kanter published a beautiful article on the art of alliances. This was the early stage, 1994, the early stage of people thinking about alliances, strategic partnerships. They didn't know what to call them, and networks. What's
your article called?
The article, I'll tell you about that because that's the core of the theory that I built. The article is called Group versus Group. Subtitle, How Alliance Networks Compete. And that's really the essence. If there's one message that I want to leave your listeners and watchers with, it is that when we think about ecosystem, and I did not use the term ecosystem in that article because it had not been introduced yet. Jim Moore introduced that just that following 2 years later in a book called The Death of Competition. And before that, we talked about networks. We talked about the virtual corporation. We talked about the extended enterprise. All of these things had to do with a company working with other players in the industry, other partners, and together competing in a way, like I would say in the article, as a group, as an entity, even though it's a loose entity. And so the essence of that kind of competition is not just that you as a company have to cooperate. You do. That's how you get these partners, these allies to work with you. And you have to cooperate in multiple cases. You have to have many partners very often. But you compete against another group that is playing that same game. And so MIPS Computer Systems was competing with Sun Microsystems that had the same game. Sun Microsystems also had what I called a constellation of partners around them, and they competed against MIPS. And later on, even IBM created their own version of this, which was called the PowerPC. And in that, they had Motorola, they had Apple, they had a whole bunch of other companies that also competed as a group. And so the essence of that kind of view, and I created a little chart in here for what it looked like, this competition between these risks. And that chart, I still use it as an example because you see right away at one blink, you see that what's going on here is that there are these companies that are all related to each other in one camp. They're competing against another camp where everybody's also related to each other, and they're competing against another camp. And when you see that, you have to ask yourself, well, what kind of competition is this? It doesn't look like the old style company against company.
It's company.
It doesn't look like IBM against Apple. It looks like IBM Plus against Apple Plus, right? And so I think with that realization came, for me at least, the research agenda, which was to tease out what goes on in these groups and their group competition, and to really follow it in all industries where it seemed relevant. And at the time, it was beginning to be relevant, mostly, as I said, in computers and semiconductors. But before you know it, you start looking around, and it turns out the airlines are doing the same thing. They're competing as a group today, Star, One World, etc. And even the real estate agents were creating constellations of partners across the borders that would compete against other real estate. And so it almost has become, for me, a general lens in which you can look at a lot of industries. And now today it's so common to think that way. It was not common at the time. This was not a model that had been shown itself to be successful in a grand way, which it has now, right? Because Apple and Google and basically all the companies that were born in the late 1990s around the dot-com and all that, but they then developed further, and they only developed further and blossomed when they had this group view of their competition, when they could actually gather more partners to compete. And so today now it's maybe more standard, and now it is in the Merriam-Webster. In the Merriam-Webster. So, in my days, in 1984, it was just a complex community of organisms and the environment around them. That was an ecosystem. Today, you will get on the web the second meaning, something such as a network of businesses considered to resemble an ecological ecosystem. And so, in other words, all they're saying is you can use this as an analogy if you'd like, if you think it resembles an ecological ecosystem. Maybe that's useful, and maybe it's not.
Interesting. I'm going to go back and see what year it was that Merriam-Webster added that second definition.
Yeah. So I have used a different analogy rather than the biological one, which is this ecosystem. I have used the idea of astronomical constellations. And that's just an English word, like a constellation of firms, which is a set of firms. And it's a constellation of firms when they are linked together and they can act in some way as a unit. This is never a strong single unit. It's always, like an amoeba. But when they can act in some way as a unit, then they become constellations that compete against other constellations.
Got it. So then I'm sure that you meandered for many years and tried things that didn't quite fit. But after that, I think that mastery comes when it's simple, right? So I think that your model is so simple, but I just want to acknowledge that it comes from lots and lots of study and trial and error. Could you just briefly walk us through your model?
Sure. So what you're describing is the end result, at least the result as of when I published the book, Remix Strategy, which you kindly mentioned earlier. So that book, again, includes a large section on multi-partner combinations. Because it turns out for all these years, I would teach about alliance strategy in companies. And normally we would talk about a joint venture or an alliance, and they would learn about how to manage them and what the tools are. And when all of that was in a way on the table, I would say, oh, now folks, you got to think about this in multiple. You got to think about having many of these and how do you manage that constellation? And in the early days, most people would say, now you've really complicated my world because alliances are hard enough and now we have to do them in multiples. It turns out that that was the reaction early on. But today, in a way, companies start there. They start for the point of view that we have many partners. How do we manage this? And all of those things, whether it's many partners or one partner, are business combinations. And business combinations is what I talk about in the book, Remix Strategy. And it turns out that even when you include things like mergers and acquisitions, also are business combinations. Okay. When you include them and ecosystems and strategic partnerships and joint ventures, all these forms are forms of combination, and they all follow three simple rules. And so this is what I would call maybe my model now, which is that there are three laws of business combination. They're really quite simple, like the rules of chess. They're kind of simple to describe in one shot, but then they will take a lifetime to master.
Yes, so you got combinations of, I think Bruce Lee said, you only need one block and one punch, but you combine them in multiple ways.
Oh, perfect. That's a great example too. So that's another form of remix. Yeah. Obviously, we see this in art. We see this everything. I mean, everything that we do in life is a combination of ideas of other people. Inventions are always built on top of other inventions. So when you think about competition today, think of it actually not as a chess game, but as a game of poker. And when you have a game of poker, you'll have a hand of cards. And any one of those cards may or may not be valuable, but the combination of the cards is what's going to give you a winning hand, right? Or a losing hand. And if you can just get the additional card you need to complete that royal flush, then you have a winning hand, right? So that's the idea, that when you have combinations of assets and combinations of resources, if you have it just right, if you get the right combination, you can have a winning hand.
Yep.
It says, I, as a company, have a certain skill set and capability and intellectual property and resources. And I need other players in my constellation in order to complete this hand and to be able to compete against the other players that are also doing the same thing. And so one of the things you have to think about is, how do I create value when I add another player to my group? And so the first rule of any business combination is a simple one. I call it 1 + 1 = 3. Okay. This is not a fancy term. And in fact, it's just, rhetoric. It's used in business all the time. But when you think about 1 + 1 = 3, it's very important to be very rigorous about that and to think really, what is the joint value that is being created? When we put them together, do we have more scale? Do we have a more complete product, greater scope, maybe greater depth of product? Do we reach more markets? Do we have more agility to change and go in different directions with new options as things change? All of these things are pluses, right? All of these are benefits that you get from adding together. And so the network advantages that we often think of, where, more players means almost exponentially greater value to each player, that's a very classic network effect, which you'll get, again, when you have a constellation that has that feature. Not all constellations have that. Some of them do. So 1 + 1 = 3 is like the first thing to really get right. It doesn't pay to add members to your group if they're not adding to the 3. Yeah. Because every time you add a member, it's actually an additional cost. It's additional burden. It's an additional slowing down the whole group. So you only add them when you can add to the value of the group that way. And the countervailing part to that is that as we add them, it gets harder to manage. Right? Because there's more players involved. And that's the second rule of any business combination, which is not 1 + 1 = 3, but 1 + 1 = 1. By that, I don't mean that the value is now 1. It's still got to be 3 or 4 or 5, right? But it now has to manage itself so that it doesn't look like a chaotic group of players that are all fighting each other. So, the more you have internal competition and duplication and companies that have conflicts of interest with each other, if you have that in your constellation, that leads to 1 + 1 not really acting like 1, because they will all go in different directions and they will pull you apart. And so this great vision of creating more value will fail if, in fact, you cannot govern those combinations in a way that, makes it look like it's unity to some sort. E pluribus unum, right? From many, we create one.
This is probably a follow-up question for later, but have you looked at different mechanisms for acting as one?
Yeah, I mean, it's very specific to an industry itself, what mechanisms they use, right? Because the underlying principle for acting as one is to have interests that align. That's why I said an important question is whether there's a lot of competition and conflict of interest inside the group. If you go back to the very early constellations would have been the Japanese keiretsu, right? They were very clear about, we have one steel producer, we have one auto producer, we have one computer maker in our keiretsu, not 5, 1. Because if we had several, we would have competition. And so it's very important to have in your group those players that could mesh together, that have an aligned interest together. And then you have to actually govern them so that they can talk to each other, so they can share what they have, so that any joint products that need to be developed or, interface between pieces of the product have to be worked out.
Right.
So again, depending on the industry. Yeah. Yeah. Like if you're in the airline industry, you're working out network routes. If you're in the computer industry, you're working out APIs, right? So the elements of coordination are going to be different. But it's important to have aligned interest and then to coordinate them somehow. And that's, in a way, the way to manage it so that it could create that joint value, right? So rule number 1 is the joint value. Number 2 is govern it so that it actually can act as one. And rule number 3 is the trickiest one and the one that actually becomes a stumbling block very often. And that's the rule which is a little more complicated to say, but it's 1 + 1 equals 1.4 plus 1.6. Or 1.7 plus 1.3, or 1.2 plus 1.8. You get the idea that the stuff that it adds up to has to be 3.
I see. Right. But your point is, like, what would be a formula that wouldn't qualify? 1 + 1 equals?
Well, the thing is this. It's just a way to think about the split of value, right? So you only have a value.
1 + 1 equals 0.9 plus 2.1.
That wouldn't, you could do that. That would be one of them that's actually earning less than they could on their own.
Right.
If you're telling me there's 0.9 is what they get out of it, they could be 1 if they stay by themselves. So that, in a way, let's say it's 1.5 plus 1.5, let's say equal distribution of the joint value. That's possible, right? Not always the case. In fact, it's not usually the case that partnerships, divide value in some equal way. But if one side in some way grabs more than its share and leaves the other side worse off than they would have been if they weren't even playing with you, then they're leaving, right? That other side leaves at that point. So this third law is one that I would call, it's not quite a fairness law in the sense that everybody has to earn the same. I don't think that's the case. But it is a sort of sufficiency of earnings that if I'm doing all this work and I'm getting only 10% more than I could have done if I just were myself, it might not be worth it, right? Yeah. So I have to think about, am I getting enough of a return to continue to cooperate in this constellation? And typically what happens is that sometimes companies don't have enough benefit that they get from an ecosystem and they split. I mean, they might go to another ecosystem where they have a larger chance of getting a larger share. And again, you see that in airlines, you see that in computers where companies may split off or might change from one group to the other. Yes. So this notion of group versus group is still the case, but the players inside the group keep moving around. Yes. Not very different from baseball in that you have teams of people that again have value, and that have value only because of their playing with the other team players, right? Even on their own, a pitcher is not worth anything. So a pitcher with a catcher, at least you got a ball being thrown. Yes. And then, the rest of the team has to be there. They each have their role. And so they all play their role in the group. And again, if they find that they're not getting paid enough by one team, they could try to go to another team where they might get paid more. Yes. And what determines what they get paid? What determines the sharing of value, right? This question about how you split this value. Well, it has to do with how valuable you are to the group. Yes. And then one way to think about it is that you come to the group, you add some value to the group. You could claim some of that value. You can hardly claim more than what you add to the group because then they will kick you out.
Gotcha. Fascinating. I guess my question is, for a company that has not thought in this way, has not engaged in ecosystems or, and they have a different model of company versus company competition. What's been your experience and what kind of changes they need to make in order to be effective in ecosystem-based competition? Mindset, capabilities, key success factors, organization, structure, incentives, whatever those things are. What have you seen the barriers are that need to change?
The answer is yes to all of those.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing is a strategic question.
Okay.
Right? The strategic question is you have to understand to what extent your strategy does depend on other players. It's not always the case. Like, we're now a little bit enamored. We see it everywhere. It's a word that's used like everywhere. It's a little overdone. And so, yes, it is important to work with other players, but to really have a full-fledged, what you might call a constellation like MIPS had, or like the airlines where you have 20 partners, 100 partners, whatever. That kind of strategy is a particular kind of strategy. It's an ecosystem strategy. So you have to decide if you need an ecosystem strategy or if you can kind of continue whatever, a little more traditional business where you produce something and sell it at a good value and make a profit. So if you need an ecosystem strategy, then I think the next question is to figure out why and what are the components of that ecosystem or constellation that are valuable. Like, do you need suppliers to be part of the deal? Do you need technology standards to be common in this constellation? Do you need a brand that oversees them all, like the airlines do, et cetera, right? So what are in a way, the moving parts of your business, and which of those moving parts would get enhanced, 1 and 1 is 3, by having some coordination with other players that would be part of your ecosystem? If you can envision that, then you have a good reason for an ecosystem strategy, and you already have some ideas about who should be in your group, because you've kind of defined maybe the value chain elements or the value stack elements that you might want. And then I think the hard work becomes that you need to understand how partnerships work. And that those are not business as usual, again, because you don't control everything, and ecosystem is not in control. No one controls the whole group. They always have a negotiated balance of power inside the group, and they need to manage this constellation with that in mind. And so becoming the ecosystem visionary that actually invites people in and creates this platform is in itself a skill and a strategic task that usually doesn't get done in one fell swoop, like let's do this and here's the blueprint. It grows over time. Because most ecosystems, like any real biological ecosystem, they accumulate, they grow, right? And you might have some idea of how they should grow, and you create incentives to make it grow that way, but it never comes to being in one fell swoop. And that actually gives you a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, because unless you have the group already, you might not have all the benefits to attract more players.
So then let's take the scenario of not creating the ecosystem, but deciding which ecosystem to plug into. I don't know. I've come up with some technology. Do I want to make it part of the Alexa ecosystem or the Google Home ecosystem? Or
that's I think a clear right analysis of your industry structure. And in this case, industry structure would include the constellation structure, the group structure, network structure, if you will, or something like that. It will tell you a little bit about what could you add to the Alexa system or to the Siri system, right? Or to the Google Home system, right? And it's very important to always think about what you can add, because you will be valued to the extent that you add something. So if you think of it only in terms of what can they give me and, I want to be with Google, they're so big, I love it. No, that's not enough. It's like, what do you add to Google so that they can then share some of the value with you? I would kind of turn it around that way. And so if it's very clear that your particular gizmo or your approach or your business model seems to work well and add some value to the Apple ecosystem, then maybe that's the one to join. Alternatively, Google might have another ecosystem, or Facebook might have another one, or Microsoft will have another one, IBM will have one, right? And so again, what you add to them matters. And that also will determine a little bit of what kind of role you end up playing in that group.
Yeah.
Think about the baseball players again. When do they go and join a new team? Well, if they get a good job there, if they get to play first base and they got a decent salary. That's only going to happen if you are a really good first baseman.
Got it. And then zooming back and kind of taking this big macro view, I'm kind of wondering, in some spaces you see a few ecosystems, in some spaces you see lots of smaller ecosystems. And just what has been coming to mind for me is that those, traditional concepts of economies of scale and switching costs probably like play a role to decide how fragmented this will be at the ecosystem level or the constellation level. Have you thought about that or looked at that?
Of course. I mean, one of the ways to think about it is how exclusive is the ecosystem. And once you're in it, are you tied into it? Like you said, the switching cost. And in some ecosystems, you're making quite a commitment when you join it. Let's say you have to design your product to fit the pieces of the other players, whether it's a computer standard or a physical component. Once you design it to fit another system, or in the case of airlines, when your route structure is fitting really tight with the other players in your constellation, airline constellation, it's a cost to say, okay, I'm scratching that, I'm going somewhere else and having a new route structure or a new product design or a new technical design, right? So you do have, in a way, a switching cost. Now, not all ecosystems are like that. Some of them are a little bit more easy come, easy go. I could sell my stuff on eBay, or I could turn around and sell it on Mercari or whatever other sources there might be. It doesn't take much. It's like a matter of just copying and pasting. In that case, there isn't a lot of exclusivity, and all these ecosystems in a way that are so permeable to each other. Basically, they get players easily, but they also lose them easily. They don't get commitment. Whereas the ones that are harder to join, like in any barrier to entry, probably require companies in the game to make a larger commitment. If you are in the old days in the IBM PC camp, or you are in the Apple camp, or even before that, if you were in the Sony Betamax camp, or you're in the Matsushita VHS camp, ecosystem competition existed for a long time. If you are in one of these camps, you're tied into it and you have a certain technology that you've kind of made a bet on. Now, economies of scale is another factor which is important. And I think one way to think of it is that, yes, these ecosystems or constellations could create scale economies because of the number of players they have. So scale economies may not be only inside one firm or one player, which would have to be a big firm or a big player, but they can be shared. Not all scale economies are like that. Some of them are basically rooted in a plant scale economy. So that's not a matter of having allies. But there are other scale economies that, for example, again, in the airlines, the larger the reach of one of these airline constellations, in a way, the larger the market they can get, and therefore the more load they can have on their large transatlantic flights, for example. So they can improve their scale utilization by having a larger catch basin of players.
Yeah, and I guess you do see sometimes if there's scale advantages to it, those things get carved out as like utilities or shared services. Like I think in credit unions, for example, there are these companies that provide back office technology platform services to small credit unions because it's more efficient. Then that becomes sort of an ecosystem or shared.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, basically what you're describing there is, I would say the structure, if you were to draw the organizational structure of a constellation or of an ecosystem, there will be variations, right? So you described one where there's a joint utility that everybody ties into and uses, and that joint utility, a credit card company, et cetera, they do the back office and they have scale economies for that. And then they have the partnerships in order to reach the banks and reach the merchants and reach the consumers and affiliation groups. So their partnerships in a way help build their common resource. That particular ecosystem is organized that way. Other ecosystems will leave the scale economies inside the players themselves and kind of get scale by combining more of them together. It will vary, and I think there is a whole, probably still understudied field of the organizational structure of ecosystems and of constellations. And I don't think it's very different to think about that compared to when we think about organizational structure of firms, because we're doing the same thing there. Inside a firm, we are bundling resources. A firm is a bundle of resources that is managed administratively by the firm. It has certain resources that it adds and it acquires and it puts them together and it organizes how it should manage them. When you think about a group of firms or a constellation or an ecosystem, it's still a bundle of resources, but it so happens these resources are not owned the same parent company. They are owned by different companies that are to some extent independent or interdependent, however you want to call it. They obviously depend on each other to some extent. But how do we organize that? And there, I think we have the new phenomenon of platform economics or digital platforms as a tool It's a tool. I mean, it's basically one way to organize the transactions between players that are together forming a constellation or an ecosystem. And the platform is maybe the way they exchange resources or they meet each other or they make contracts, etc. And so that's where, in a way, digital platforms and platform strategy comes in and overlaps with ecosystem strategy.
Yes. Yes. I have several questions, but I know we're reaching the top of our time with you. One very quick question is, for you, what is the difference between a platform and a constellation or ecosystem?
Yeah, I think they are friendly concepts to each other, meaning that if I have an ecosystem, which means I have a lot of different players that somehow I have to interact. In today's world, the digital world, it's often the case that I want to use a digital platform, which is a tool for organizing the way these players work. So that's one way. And secondly, if I have a digital platform, if I say my business really is to provide connections between buyers and sellers or makers and creators or creators and consumer, whatever, however I think, or transportation needs and transportation providers, right? Whatever my different players are in the platform I have in mind, those players, they're not always part of an ecosystem, by the way. They could be customers. I don't think eBay has an ecosystem of 10 million people, however many people are using it on a daily basis.
Right.
Those
they
are
interact
customers.
with each other. Yes.
Right? But they interact with each other, but on a fairly transactional basis.
Yeah.
But they do have an ecosystem with a payment structure, with a maybe communication structure, with a back office structure. So they do have elements that create what I would call their ecosystem. So I wouldn't confuse partners with customers. There are some customers that become like partners, but there are many customers that are transactional that are not necessarily partners. So a platform can be created to enable customers, drivers of cars and users of cars. Those are whatever, independent contractors, if that's what the law says now, right? But they're not partners. Yeah. And so Uber is a platform. You could say it's an ecosystem because people use that word very broadly. But I think it's a very different ecosystem than when you look at the hardwired ecosystem of airlines or computers or any other company that really has a stack of components that have to be fit together. That's different than having customers use each other. But it's still a platform. It's still a platform.
That makes
sense. It's overlapping with constellation, and it can be used in a constellation, but you can have a constellation without a platform, and you can have a platform without an ecosystem, or at least without a major one.
Fascinating. You mentioned in the beginning that the term ecosystem didn't really exist when you started studying it, and now it's a popular term. And so, my question is it really true that ecosystem, constellation, combination-based competition is becoming more important? Or has it always been important and now the terminology is getting popular? There's our whole thesis, which is here that we're shifting increasingly towards ecosystem-based competition being more central to the success of enterprises. Is that even true?
I think that's a very good question, by the way. Just because we see it being more popular, is that really the case that it actually is more essential in a way to the economy? And I think that the tendency there is, yes, there are more cases where ecosystem competition is the way to go. It's like no other choice. And partly that is because there are more digital components. Whenever you have digital components, digital pieces, it means that everybody has a piece of the puzzle, but you never have the whole digital solution. And so when you have that, other people have other pieces of that puzzle. And again, that's different than if I put down a paper plant, a machinery comes in and wood comes out and paper comes out the other hand, I have a company. In this case, my company doesn't have all the resources it needs to compete. It has only one feature, if you will, or a piece. The other part is that many companies are restricting themselves to their core, and they are shedding a lot of what in a way would be ancillary services, etc. They would rather have those ancillary services from partners. And that's very common. And it's actually, I think, a good trend, because from this focus on the core, you could get better management and better strategy in that core. And then you use the partnerships to work on those pieces that are not necessarily your best thing, but you work with somebody else that has it as their best thing. So to the extent that the world is more digital, to the extent that it has more modularity in a way, and to the extent that it's more global, those all add to the need for a constellation type of competition. The global part is very clear because, you often have different variations of what you're doing in different countries or different regions. And so you get the formation of franchising systems or joint ventures across borders to address different national needs, or even to deal with different technological sources that are coming from different places. We have multiple sources of excellence now, much more than maybe we had in the 1950s. And because of that multiple source of excellence, we often are in a situation where we have to combine excellence from different partners rather than think that we have it all in-house. So in that sense, yes, we can't do it all alone anymore.
Yes. I'll probably follow up later and understand the logical connection there. I can make a logical connection, but I'm not sure I fully understand.
Do you want me to lay it out further? Or?
Well, I guess what I hear is kind of a plausible argument for me is not so much that you have to, but the cost of putting the APIs in place is lower. So it's easier for you to do it in combination when there's more digital.
Yeah, let's go back to that. The digital adds a certain amount of modularity. That means that each component has its own integrity, but it needs to be used with other components that have their own integrity. And different companies might be expert in different components. The origin would be hardware and software. But when you think of software, there's application, there's systems, there's cloud, there's many different elements of that. So that's what I would think about there. You're right. Obviously, if you want to make a strong argument for it, we'd have to work out the theory a little bit more, maybe. The way to think about it is the multiplicity of elements that need to be combined because your business is now more interdependent on other pieces than maybe in the traditional 1950s view of the manufacturing industry. And when you have that interdependence, when you have a lot of interdependence, whether it's because of geographic or technological or some other cross-industry, right? So the whole idea that you can have partnerships across industry boundaries and some kind of convergence between industries, all of that, and that's also been a talk for 30, 40 years, right? That there can be all these industries are coming together. Well, that also leads to a bias towards partnership rather than towards owning it all. And if you have a bias towards partnership, then you could say, well, usually it's more than one partner, and then it becomes a constellation.
Love it. Love it. Wow. It's always difficult to sit with someone who's been thinking so many moves ahead for so many years, and I'm trying to keep up, but I'm getting a vision of how there could be this reconfiguration of industries through partnerships, and maybe industries no longer become kind of the defining bucket that a company fits in.
Well, let me just add to that. There are many buckets, and it's a multi-level game. Okay. So the way I think about this is there's a group game, and the group versus group determines a little bit where value will end up. But then inside the group, there is a company versus company game because they negotiate about the split of value. So whenever you think about where do I get my profitability or success from, it's at two levels. It's I need to be in a group that is strong and that can beat other groups and win in some way. And then I have to be a key player in that group so that I can, in a way, capture my share of that value.
Interesting. Yes. 1 + 1 = 3, and 1 + 1 = more than 1.
Exactly.
Yeah. Fascinating.
And in the end, I have to manage it in a different way because I can't. There's no command and control in this kind of world, right? It's a world of negotiating with allies.
Yeah, love it. Well, Ben, thank you so much. This has been mind-blowing and exciting, and we so appreciate you taking the time to share with us some of the insights that you've garnered over so long studying this space.
Thank you, Kai-Han. Always a pleasure talking with you and with your listeners. And I hope they'll follow up and do some of the reading that I've written, because it's hard to say in half an hour the depth of what you see in the world.
And starting with one of those LinkedIn courses is a very accessible way to begin. Lovely. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Ness, our editor, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kai-Han Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next week with another episode of Outthinkers.